Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's really nice to be with all of you. My name is Vijay Prashad. I'm speaking to you in my capacity as a member of the group No Cold War, which is an international platform which was set up a few years ago around a statement. You can read the statement at nocoldwar.org. It's an important statement because we came out a few years ago just to say we want more collaboration in the world and less confrontation. We think that the new Cold War imposed by the United States on Eurasia, particularly on China, is raising the temperature of world affairs. And rather than have people collaborate to solve the basic problems of humanity, the dilemmas of humanity, rather than that, we have people increasing military spending, pushing the confrontation of human differences into war. We've seen since we put forward the No Cold War statement, we've seen war break out in Ukraine, direct shooting war. We've seen this terrible genocidal war against the Palestinian people in Gaza, but also, of course, the war continuing against the Palestinian people in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. Horrible, horrible, unbelievable violence against people who cannot flee anywhere and are dying of starvation now, apart from the bombs. I often tell people war leads to long-term traumas because you don't understand what the war zone is like. It's noisy, it's dusty, it's filled with toxic substances because we build our buildings with a lot of toxic metals and chemicals. And when you blow up a building, you send into the air ghastly substances that destroy the lungs of little children and damage them for their entire lives. This is not just a war where 30,000 Palestinians have been killed. This is a genocidal attack on 2.3 million people who live in Gaza, 2.3 million Palestinians. No Cold War is about talking about collaboration, discussion, discourse, communication, conversation. And that's precisely what we're doing with these webinars, including this one. This webinar is co-sponsored by a series of platforms, institutes, and organizations. I want to just read their names out. They're all important. Alba Movimentos is an important network of organizations in Latin America set up as part of the Bolivarian dynamic of integration of Latin American people against the attempt for their sovereignty to be taken away by the United States. And let us say the word now for the first time, and its hyper-imperialist ambitions. The second organization is Pan-Africanism Today, which brings together a set of African organizations, whether it's peasant movements like Miwata in Tanzania, or trade unions in South Africa and Nigeria, or in fact, the West African People's Organization, which is itself a network and from whom we're going to hear later today. It's also brought to you by the International Strategy Center based in Seoul, South Korea, a platform which attempts to understand and to dial the tension down of the conflicts in Northeast Asia, including Japan, the Korean Peninsula, Philippines, and so on. That's International Strategy Center based in Seoul, South Korea. This event is also brought to you by the Instituto Simón Bolívar, based in Caracas, Venezuela, a frontline state of the attempt by the United States to impose war instead of dialogue on the world. Venezuela, a country that has faced sanctions and attack for a very long period. And later we'll hear from the president of the Instituto Simón Bolívar. Also, this event is brought to you by the institute that I direct, Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which is part of a much bigger process called the International People's Assembly, an organization or a platform of almost 300 political and social movements from around the world, including and importantly, the landless workers of Brazil, from whom we'll hear later today in this webinar. This webinar is around a text produced by Tricontinental Institute for Social Research in collaboration with Global South Insights, It's a text that's called Hyper-imperialism, a dangerous, decadent new state. I want to say a few words about this text itself before turning it over to our first two speakers, who are in fact, in the team that wrote this text and would be best positioned to talk about it. But this text, Hyper-imperialism, is published in January of this year, on the 100th anniversary, the 100th death anniversary of Lenin, the leader of the revolution in Russia. Now, why I'm saying that is not only because I have a great respect for Lenin, but also because over 100 years ago, Lenin wrote a compelling and important pamphlet called Imperialism. He published that pamphlet at a time when there were inter-imperialist conflicts in Europe that led to the First World War, the Great War, as it was called then. The inter-imperialist conflicts took place mainly in Europe, where different imperial powers were jockeying for influence and control over the rest of the world. That period of inter-imperialist conflict came to a close, in a sense, after World War II, when we entered a new period, when a different kind of international geography took hold. There were principally three blocks in the world in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The West, the imperialist West on the one side, the socialist camp on the other, and the third world. And you entered into a period where inter-imperialist conflicts didn't seem to drive the contradictions of world history. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, we entered a third period when there was a kind of unipolarity imposed by the United States on the rest of the world. That period came to a close, and we entered a fourth era, a period that opens up with the Third Great Depression from 2008, when new entities emerged: China, Russia, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, and so on, to take space from that unipolar moment and to contest unipolarity. It is in this context, the fourth phase since Lenin's imperialism, that we are calling hyper-imperialism. It's a very important text. It's freely downloadable from the Tricontinental website in at least Spanish, Portuguese, and English. Other languages will be up in time. I highly recommend that people look at it. It's 186 pages long. It's filled with a great deal of data and of interest. So in order for us to be oriented into this text, I'm happy that the first two speakers, each of our speakers taking about 8 minutes to reflect not only on this text, but on things that interest them. The first two speakers are people who helped build this text. So it's important that we start with them. We're going to open with Gisela Cernadas, who is with No Cold War, with Global South Insights, with a lot of things. She's an economist from Argentina and played a key role in doing a lot of the analysis for this text, particularly the landmark section on global military spending and share of global military spending. So Gisela, welcome. This is your platform. You're part of the No Cold War team. Take it away. It's your time now.
All right. Thank you, Vijay. Thank you for the warm introduction, and thank you everybody for being here today. It's a big pleasure for me to be sharing this event with all of you. So going to what it's calling us today, which is this hyper-imperialism study, and I would like to introduce four main things that I want to highlight of the study as the main take-home messages. So the first one is related to the characteristics of this new stage of the imperialism, as Vijay mentioned in the introduction. The definition that we used of hyper-imperialism doesn't aim to reflect that it is a super powerful and invincible imperialism, but it reflects the exaggerated and kinetic way in which the imperialism is conducted. And this way, it doesn't happen by accident, but it's because of the constraints that the moribund imperialism led by the global north finds in this context. And it's taking us to the second point, which is the second key point, is defining who is the global north and how they behave. So in this study, we defined the global north as a group of 49 countries composed by the white settler states, European countries, and Japan. And here it is important to mention not only that who they are, but also how they behave. And this is an integrated military, political, and economic bloc. And it is a bloc that is led by the US. This is what we can call the imperialist camp in today's world. And this imperialist camp has a core, which is an Anglo-American core, composed by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and noteworthy here, Israel. These are the countries with the closest trust with the US intelligence, and they are the core of this imperialist camp in the world. And here it's also important to note in this second point that the way that the global north works in an articulated way is in direct opposition with the condition of the global south, which is very diverse. And if we want to define who is the global south, I think that we can quote here to the joint declaration between NATO and the European Union, who defined the rest of the world as the global south. So the global south is not an articulated bloc, nor politically, nor economically, and nor military as well. And despite this diversity and this non-articulation, we can move into the third takeout of this report, or this study, which is that the global south, in a stark of reality, is gaining more relative power over the global north. So we can see this relative loss of power of the global north in terms of the GDP in the world, for instance. The global south has surpassed the global north and now represents 60% of the world GDP, speaking in purchasing power parity terms. Also, the combined GDP of the 10 countries that comprise the BRICS countries has surpassed to that of the G7. And similarly occurs with the share of the industrial value in the world, in which the global south represents between 56 to 70% of the industry value added in the world. Thus, there is a southwards economic shift in the world, and this should be a very important point to consider from the study. And the last point I want to highlight is that, as we mentioned in the study, the hegemony is historically lost in 3 stages, which are production, finance, and military. And as I mentioned in the previous point, the global north is losing economic relative power in front of the global south. And the US particularly has lost the hegemony in production, though still remains strong in technological areas, including those that are related to the military. And the financial hegemony is being challenged, but still is in very early stages of challenging. And we move to the third point, which is the military hegemony. And in this case, the military is, we can see that this is clearly the last pillar and the strongest pillar of the imperialist camp today. And here I want to quote an example from the Hyper-imperialism study. The military spending of the US-led military bloc, which includes the NATO and no-NATO allies, accounted for more than 74% of the world military spending in 2022. And moreover, in another study published in Monthly Review in November of 2023, we found that the military spending of the US is not only double of what they report, but it also represents about 70% of the consumption and investment spending of the US federal government. So these figures are just insane and expose the hypocrisy of the West, which, these countries are claiming to be the representation of the moral and the democracy in the world, and they are actually pro-war. And, in this case, it's very easy to make a quick search online, and we can find a lot of accusations against China regarding military spending. But the truth is that China's per capita spending is half of the world's average per capita military spending, while that of the US is more than 12 times the world average. So even if you check what is happening with the US bases, the US has more than 900 military bases in foreign countries. And it is a country that historically has been in war and pushing other countries to the war. There have been less than 20 years of peace in the history of the United States since 1776. So this exaggerated spending suggests that the military is not only the last and strongest pillar of the imperialist camp, but it also represents a clear threat for the future of humanity. So, to conclude, after these four main points of the report, I would like to highlight that within the next decade, it will be the first time that a non-white country will lead the economy in the world. And unlike the West, China didn't base its growth in the colonialism, in slavery, and in thieves. It represents a clear difference with the bloodbath and the crimes against humanity that the Western powers had perpetuated in the global South countries. So we are now in a transition to a new stage of history. And this stage of moribund imperialism, despite the diversity of the contradictions that it has, the emerging global South represents the hope for the future of the humanity and the peace in the world. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gisela. That was Gisela Cernadas, who was one of the authors of the hyper-imperialism text that we're talking about today. We're going to have another one of the researchers and authors come in immediately. That's Michaela Erskog. Mika works as a researcher at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. She's also on the Secretariat of Pan-Africanism Today, and has a podcast called The Crane, in and out podcast called The Crane. So Mika, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you everyone who's joined, and thank you, Gisela. I'm one of my colleagues and collaborators in creating this text, and in the next few months we're going to try to deconstruct and work on some of the areas that we couldn't touch on. So the area I want to talk about is related to the global South, because we initially started with trying to understand the military, political, and economic power of the global North and ensure that people around the world understood that in this particular moment in history, the global North is not just, a gathering of friends. It's a very concrete military bloc that has very concrete, shared, and coordinated interests. But the global South, on the other hand, has, primarily in the last few years been a loose and rather imprecise reference that didn't necessarily have any kind of collective agreements, associations, or agendas. And we wanted to talk a little bit about the global South in this document because, of course, as we all know, the world we live in, there is a division of humanity right now. We see that with the way in which Ukrainian refugees are treated versus Palestinian refugees. But we didn't want to necessarily dull or fall into the hopelessness of the fact that the global North is a huge military power and has huge military apparatus at its hand. We wanted to be able to create some forms of let's say, a little better precision about how we understand the global South and how we can articulate a more concrete global South demand, because this term has been floating around for many years, but hasn't necessarily had the kind of cohesion and collective identity that is required for us to basically fight against the strength of the US-led imperialist bloc. And part of it is that, one, as Gisela said, that the global South already, if we look at it in economic terms, has a larger share of the GDP, the world GDP, than the global North. Two is that even though there's a huge diversity of countries, there are 145 countries we group in the global South, we try to think about what are the common themes and certain kind of groupings that we have and that we can put together in order to galvanize a shared agenda. And what we found was, or what we are proposing, and again, there's a relative element of subjectiveness, but we're hoping to invite people to discuss this and interrogate this and to kind of give a lot of input in is two, that there are certain themes that they are grouped around. And we have those who are leading in the socialist camp, those who are fighting for sovereignty, those who are newly non-aligned and seem to be developing a national bourgeoisie that is relatively independent from the global north historically. We're looking at those who are historically progressive, countries like South Africa, Bolivia, and others who lead a certain agenda. And we've seen that with how South Africa brought Israel to the ICJ. And then we look at other groupings that are a little bit less defined or don't have a common agenda in terms of the broader, diverse global south, as well as those who unfortunately are under the thumb of the US, like the Philippines and South Korea. And part of the groupings that we're creating is not necessarily to create a static mold and force people into an area, but is to think about what are the common themes that different global south countries are advancing, and what are the ways in which these kinds of groupings can make us think differently about how we can push a different agenda for that is in favor of humanity, that is in favor of progress, that is in favor of sovereignty. And in the end, we look a little bit about how there are new multilateral organizations that we are trying to consider what the potentiality is. Many of them, of course, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter, the United Nations Charter, are very new, are very embryonic. But if you look in objective terms, BRICS, for example, those 10 countries, they represent 45% of the world's population. They represent 35% of the GDP and 44% of the global industrial output. So there's a significantness in terms of mass, but we haven't necessarily got into a qualitative phase in which we could see some actual material change happening. But we think that it's important for us to take stock of what they could mean, especially since there's a trend that is moving southwards, as Gisela said, in terms of economy, manufacturing power, in terms of the energy grouping. The BRICS 10 is about, I think it's like 30-something%. And so we're hoping, and I'm so glad that we have so many people from very different backgrounds who are here, very different organizations, very different parts of the world, because some of the concrete things that we think could be common opportunities that we can advance are things like multilateralism, new modernization, innovation, reparations, sovereignty, environmental justice, many elements. But we do need to push more into how these commonalities can get specificity and how we can coordinate better amongst people's movements, amongst researchers, amongst intellectuals, amongst policymakers, that the global south becomes a more material force and isn't necessarily just left to what it was before, which is this kind of vagueness that doesn't necessarily have an impact. So I'm really excited and thankful for this opportunity and happy that everyone has joined us, and I'm hoping that we can continue to debate these things. And if anyone wants to add anything to this document, you can contact me. I'm one of the coordinators at Tricontinental. You can find my email. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mika. Just a reminder, Mika's talking about this text, Hyper-imperialism, which you can download. You can print it out, as I did, from a Tricontinental website. It's filled with charts like this, which represent the global north. It's filled with data, because we believe that you build theory from the facts, not from ideology. And so this is a terrific exploration of the world as we see it, but based on data. If you are joining us now and haven't selected an interpretation button, you need to have Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, English. There's a globe down there. Don't forget to do that. It takes a second to do it. Well, very happy to move this along. It's a pleasure for me to invite now Rania Khalek, who is a journalist based in Beirut, Lebanon. Rania has a number of shows on Breakthrough News. If you don't watch Breakthrough News, I recommend you do. There's some terrific programs at Breakthrough. Her programs are terrific. She has a show called Dispatches. She travels all around the world. Recently interviewed a leader of Ansar Allah in Yemen, giving his own view as the Yemeni government sees it regarding what's happening in Palestine. A very important journalist that you are, Rania. Your other show is The Freedom Side with your host, Eugene Pourier, and I'm sure you'll be happy to know that Eugene is watching you now as you join us to present on hyper-imperialism. Rania, take it away.
Well, hello, Eugene, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And also thank you for inviting me to participate. It's really an honor to speak alongside such a stellar cast of incredibly smart people. And I'm talking to you like Vijay mentioned earlier, from Beirut, Lebanon, where every day we hear Israeli threats of genocide, that they plan to take us back to the Stone Age, that they want to copy paste Gaza onto Lebanon. But they haven't been able to do that yet because Lebanon has a very strong resistance. But since I'm here, I'm going to focus mostly on Gaza. And I think, in this moment of hyper-imperialism, of this imperialism on steroids, of this era that we're in, this hyper-imperialism seeks to destroy and punish anyone who refuses to submit to the current order. And the imperialists are willing to carry out a genocide as punishment. What Western governments have called Israel's right to self-defense, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, has so far resulted in the murder of over 30,000 Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians and overwhelmingly children. And we're all watching as Israeli society openly celebrates its crimes. They're proudly posting their genocide to social media. We're witnessing nothing short of a live-streamed Holocaust against the Palestinians of Gaza. And it's all supported by the collective West, and that egomaniacal, callous behavior of Israeli society is, I think, a reflection of what the imperialist West truly stands for. And, as Israel's genocide in Gaza reaches new heights of cruelty, many are wondering why Western regimes who claim to be these leaders of the free and civilized and lawful world are enthusiastically supporting this belligerent annihilation in Gaza. It seems kind of like they've gone crazy. They're willing to destroy the so-called rules-based order they worked so hard to create, all to protect Israel. So what do they gain? We know that Israel is their weapon in the Middle East. And like Biden said, if there weren't an Israel, we'd have to create one. We know they're racist. They don't see Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, the jungle people of the global South as human, as Joseph Borrell would say. And it's also opportunism in service to this or that lobbying group. But I think that the most important factor speaks to this hyper-imperialist order that we've entered, and that is that October 7th meant is what October 7th meant to the Western imperialist project right now. What Palestinians did in the Al-Aqsa flood operation, it struck fear into the hearts of Western leaders. They don't take kindly to indigenous people in the so-called jungle shooting at the garden. The collective West is backing the Gaza onslaught as part of a genocidal drive against the oppressed people of the entire global South. They're sending a message that this is what happens if you strike back militarily against their rotten, colonial, capitalist, hyper-imperialist system. Israel versus Gaza is the global North versus the global South, and I think everybody feels it. And, we all know the imperialists have created this world where this small group of ruling elites in the imperial core, led by the US, very effectively steal from everyone else to maintain their hoarded wealth. And if this system collapses, they lose everything. That's why they sanction. That's why they overthrow. That's why they bomb. That's why they invade. They literally shorten lifespans as a matter of policy. And this system is so parasitic, they're willing to destroy the world if it means preventing its collapse. And Gaza is a microcosm of how far they're willing to go. Let's not forget, Gaza, in addition to being a concentration camp turned now into a death camp, it's also been a laboratory, and it is a laboratory where Israel and its Western backers can test the most brutal methods of domination and control on those marked as unpeople. The people of Gaza were marked for death a long time ago. They were put on a diet, placed under siege, subjected to carpet bombing campaigns every few years, each one worse than the last. And those methods of domination and control have been exported around the world to be used on other marginalized populations to uphold this imperialist order. So we should consider this context as we watch Gaza face annihilation. We're entering an era of capitalism in crisis, of climate disaster, combined with this gradual decline of US empire, the most violent empire in history, which is terrified of the rise of China and Russia and is willing to risk nuclear war over it. And on a side note, I just want to point out that this is happening as we enter this emerging China that the US is so scared of. The resistance axis, as it's called across the Middle East, really wouldn't exist at the scale if not for the rise of a country like China. And what I mean by that is the resistance axis, it receives funding and arms from Iran. This is possible because of China. China's existence as an economic powerhouse that refuses to abide by US sanctions on Iran has allowed the Iranian economy to access goods and capital it otherwise couldn't as a result of US sanctions. So I just want to throw that out there. But back to October 7th, it triggered the collective West's worst anxieties. A bunch of brown people in the global South shot back at their plantation owners. And so they're not only practicing, high-tech methods for obliterating a population, I think they're also setting a new precedent. In the near future wars of imperialism, it's going to be hard, I think, to match up to the horrors of Gaza. And as long as the next war isn't as bad as Gaza, it might be tolerated. They're kind of expanding the goalposts of their barbarity. Even now we're seeing Gaza and we're saying, oh, it's so much worse than Iraq. It almost makes Iraq seem somehow tolerable by comparison. So we have to resist that conditioning. We should also be aware of the internal repression in the global north. I mean, this is a really mask-off moment. All of the sociopathic narcissism that underpins our dystopian global order is really on full display for everyone to see. The overwhelming, first of all, they've made a mockery of international humanitarian law. They've killed any pretense of freedom and democracy that they claim to represent. And they're also turning inward to repress their own populations from dissenting against what's happening in Gaza. And the overwhelming majority of people across the global north actually support a ceasefire, yet they don't see this reflected at all in their leadership. So the anti-democratic nature of their own rotten countries is really being laid bare for them to see. And I think the repression it's going to get worse. And I think this is where the left is crucial as an organizing and radicalizing force, though there are other people on this call who are more suited to address that. But I do think we have a huge opportunity here. And, before I wrap, I just want to talk about the resistance on the ground in the Middle East, starting with Yemen. It's the poorest country that just survived its own genocide, which was led by the US and the Saudis, while the rich Gulf monarchies normalize with Israel and humiliatingly do nothing for Gaza. This poorest country in the region, Yemen, is blocking ships in the Red Sea to exact material consequences to pressure the US, Israel, and the UK to stop the genocide. And as a result, they're getting bombed and sanctioned and designated as terrorists, but they don't care because they feel this is their moral duty to resist imperialism. And we see it in Lebanon, we see it in Iraq, we see it in Syria. These popular political and military formations are standing up to Israel, standing up to the US in solidarity with Gaza. And despite the consequences, they don't care. Because they understand liberation means sacrifice. The loss in Gaza is huge. I'm not going to lie about that. It's completely devastating. It shatters the heart. It crushes the soul. But we can never lose hope because in Gaza, every single day, there is a resistance that fights the Israelis and exacts casualties and consequences under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. They understand liberation means sacrifice, just like it did in Algeria, just like it did in South Africa, in Haiti, in Cuba, in China. And then all that's to say, we can't let these babies in Gaza die in vain. We cannot return to the status quo. And I just want to, end by saying that, we know the collective West, even with its waning power, is well organized and ideologically in sync, even if it's in the decline. So the question really becomes, and I think this is, brought out in the important Tricon report, the question becomes, can the South and its allies in the West confront this moment? Because what happens in Palestine, it's not going to stay there. The horrors we're witnessing are in so many ways a lens into what these imperialists have planned for their adversaries in a lot of the world in the future. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much. That's Rania. She has a number of shows on Breakthrough News. Be sure to watch her dispatches and, of course, the Freedom Side with Eugene Pourier. Moving along, because he knows a thing or two about the destruction of infrastructure within the global north. He knows a lot about how the countries of the global north, their governments prosecute an intense material class struggle against their own population, because he lives near Grenfell Towers in London and was one of the most vocal critics of the British government and the British ruling class over the massacre that took place in that building. Loki, like Rania, is a journalist. He works with the Mint Press news organization, a very honest and clear voice. But also, if you don't want to listen to him talk, you can listen to him rap. There is the terrific soundtrack of the Struggle trilogy and many other songs online. Loki, it's really fun to have you here because I always enjoy talking to you, and I'm sure everybody's going to enjoy your reflections on this report. Loki, based in London, coming to us at this platform.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I've been enjoying going through this excellent document, which contains so much really useful data. I think it's necessary that some of that is stated just in the beginning of what I'm going to say. And I absolutely appreciate being involved in a talk around this document. It's a resource which we all must use going forward. So, for example, I read within it that between 1776 and 2019, the US carried out over 392 military interventions worldwide, and half of those operations took place post-World War II, 1950. That is a truly incredible number. And what it really articulates is the period of history that we have witnessed to. And also it shows where all of this has been paid for. Where has this largesse for what is technically quite a small section of humanity to have such economic, military and political control? Where has that been paid for? On the backs of who has that been paid for? Of course, when we look at the founding of the East India Company in 1600, the percentage of global GDP that Britain had was something like 1.8%. And between 1757 and 1900, Britain's per capita GDP increased by 347%. So the 1.8 was Britain's share of global production. And so what we're talking about here, when we look at these 49 countries, which we identify as part of the global north, has been in some ways an aberration of history, because at the very time when Britain launched the East India Company out into the world, India and China represented about 75% of global production. And now we are going back to a period that is less of an aberration, a more natural equilibrium of global power. And I believe that what's happening today in Gaza is a demonstration to the global south by the collective global north. While it's being depicted as an Israeli project, we have to remember German arms sales to Israel throughout this period increased by 1,000%. Britain issued 26 arms export licenses throughout this period. It has sent spy planes over the top of Gaza on a daily basis. The R-1 Shadow plane is believed to be working on target acquisition in Gaza. In addition to that, the US has sent its Reaper drones over the top of Gaza on an almost daily basis. Again, they specialize in target acquisition. We also know that early on in the campaign, Biden was pictured with members of the US Delta Force, claiming they were on the ground and working on hostage rescue in Gaza. News has just come out yesterday that there's been 100 secret arms deals by the United States to Israel throughout this period. And what we also know, thanks to work by The Intercept a few month or so back, you had US Air Force officers sent to assist with targeting. So in a way, what's happening here is the dying convulsion of the dominance of the global north over the global south. And rather than the way it went out in Afghanistan through cringe and whimper, followed by economic warfare, which could be likely to kill more than the conventional warfare did, in Gaza, it's going out with a bang. And the Gaza is identified by those in the global north as ultimately the weakest part of the global south. It's isolated by land. It does not have the support of its neighbors. And so it is the easiest place where this collective might and power can be visited upon these people. And when you look at the recent news that the United States is due to build a port in Gaza and is sending 1,000 US soldiers to do it, that just came out this morning. But that port is not the same port as the one the UAE will be building on the edge of Gaza. And it just so happens that some of the largest oil and gas companies have recently signed deals with the Israelis to develop gas in and around Gaza, as was, this was discovered a few decades ago, but one of the things that was preventing these giants, these fossil fuel giants of the world from being able to develop it was, of course, the presence of a Palestinian political entity which would oppose these types of operations. So what you're seeing in Gaza is the depopulation of this territory and the land being coveted. Of course, as always with the United States and its allies, it's being wrapped up in a carefully managed PR exercise. But this, as I say, it marks a decline because it has degraded the reputation of the governments involved no end. And of course, one of the colonial boomerangs of the NATO campaign in Ukraine was that many who are on the edges, so a country like Saudi Arabia, a country like UAE, I'm not clear from the document. I think I needed to read it again and have more time to go through it, where countries like Saudi Arabia or UAE would fall in, whether they would fall in as part of those 49 nations of the global north, or they would fall in as part of the global south. But in the case of Ukraine, they took some very interesting positions. Rather than merely going along with US and NATO diktats, actually, the Saudis, for example, continued to purchase gas and oil off the Russians and then sell them on to European countries that were sanctioning Russia. And really, that speaks to the decline of this global order. Even in the UAE, an amazing example of this is I keenly observe the Arabic media, and one of the Arabic channels that I'll sometimes watch is Sky News Arabiya. So obviously it's owned by Murdoch, but it's a joint project between the Murdoch Empire and the UAE. Now, the coverage of the Ukraine war has been quite different, even from somewhere like Al Jazeera Arabic, and I'll explain how. So when it began, rather than taking the hawkish NATO line, Sky News Arabiya had a new show called Min Moscow, from Moscow, where a Russian position was being explained in Arabic, far more detailed, far more in-depth than anything you would get on Sky News English. So again, to me, this looked like a symptom of this dying power. Even when it comes to perspectives, an institution like Sky News, because of its relationship to the UAE, was forced to cover the war in Ukraine in a different way. And I think that really much of the world is being given a clear choice between what the US has to offer, which is, in the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, and in the case of Gaza, you are seeing it at its very sharpest example, as was pointed out in the document. When you look at the sites of these military interventions in the last few years or so, Mali and Iraq are number one and number two. But in the case of Iraq, for example, when we look at what has been brought there by the United States, you had, of course, 20 years of occupation, even up until today, we still have pushes from those in Iraqi society hoping to expel the US. But when you think about quite how unpopular the decision was, you had 36 million people across the planet in 3,000 demonstrations stand in the streets to protest against the occupation of Iraq. But the US still did it. And in the first month, dropped 29,000 bombs on a 4,000-year-old civilization. The US occupation displaced 1 in 25 Iraqis and killed over 1 million people. What you also have to remember is that during the period of US invasion and occupation, it was found that the US built only 19 schools in Iraq. Well, actually, 2 Chinese firms have just signed deals with Iraq to build over 8,000 schools in Iraq. So this is really the dichotomy that we're talking about. We're talking about a power that its economy is reliant on constant military stimulation around the world, and a type of world that values these key social goods. When you look at the case of Afghanistan, for example, you have the United States launching a war, and its NATO allies launching a war that produced 5.3 million refugees. That was a quarter of the entire population. It left 72% of Afghans in poverty and rendered Afghans statistically the saddest people in the world. Now, when we compare that to what has happened even since the US exit and with the Chinese, you are seeing deals of hundreds of millions of dollars being made, but also the possibility of China investing over 10 billion US dollars in the lithium reserves of Afghanistan. So those emerging from the embers of this world that the global north has built for us are turning to China for a very different type of life. For example, you look at the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank, they have loaned more to the global south than the World Bank has in recent decades. So things are moving in a brighter direction for all of humanity. But unfortunately, Gaza represents that, whether it's intransigence or malignancy, that lack of that refusal of this beast to die.
Well said, Loki. Well said indeed. Just to let you know and to announce here that Tricontinental and Global South Insights are now working on a document which analyzes West Asia and North Africa specifically, doing a deep dive of some of these countries, because like you, we have been watching changes in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman took over and then prosecuted the war in Yemen is not exactly the Saudi Arabia of today. So we are trying to do a deep dive to understand the factual situation in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and so on. Thanks a lot for that. That was tremendous. I'm very excited that we're now going to hear one of the most significant political leaders that we have in our movements. João Pedro Stedil is, of course, an economist, but that's hardly a description of him, because he's one of the founders of the landless workers movement of Brazil, the MST. The MST was founded 40 years ago. In a few months, Tricontinental will release a dossier which will provide a short assessment of the 40-year-old history of the landless workers movement of Brazil, the MST. When the MST was attacked by the right wing last year, they brought João Pedro Stedil to Brasilia to face questioning. My God, he made mincemeat of those fellows. And what I thought was most significant was when João Pedro said to the right-wing politicians that look at the lawyers who are sitting at my right and who are sitting at my left. These lawyers are children of people who fought to get the land as part of the MST process. João Pedro Stedil, 40 years after you and others created the MST, Welcome to No Cold War. I'm looking forward to hearing your reflections.
Muito obrigado, Vijay.
Thank you, Vijay. I recommend that you don't consider his words, because it was all arranged between us, because we're friends. So when I go to introduce Vijay, I also inflate his ego. I have said that he's learned to swim, which is a necessity for all revolutionaries, learning to swim. Okay, jokes aside, I want to thank the opportunity to be here among you all, to see once again so many brothers and sisters, comrades, friends, who across the planet are in different trenches in the fight side by side with the peoples of the world and against capital. I wish above all, over the next few minutes, thank and greet all the team that took part in the production of this document, Gisela and Mika especially, who are present here, on behalf of whom I greet all the team, through whom I greet all the team. It's a fantastic job. The team, coordinated by DJ, recovers the historical dialectical method for us to understand the ruling class, the behavior of the capitalists and imperialists. I am tired of seeing articles and theses that just look at the small things of the small aspects of the working class. We have to be concerned about the enemy, the ruling class, because without understanding their behaviors, interests, and methods, we won't be able to defeat them. I'm very happy when I studied the book, the document, that there is this common thread of historical understanding of how the capitalist accumulation of the global north was based for 400 years on the theft of raw materials and on slavery. In other words, slavery wasn't just a method that we must denounce of human exploitation. No, it was the heart of the accumulation of the capitalist empire. I also am heartened by the contribution from the document, which is to clarify further the concept of global north and global south, because these are recent concepts. A lot of our militants, our activists, look upon it as a geographic concept, and it's not. It's a concept of political economy, and this will have been a very important theoretical contribution for the education of our activist base all over the global south. Also, I want to highlight the fact that the study helps us to understand how, during the decadence of imperialism that Gisela called the moribund imperialism, it nevertheless puts out its claws now more than anything through the war machine, as Loki and Rania said. Be careful, Loki, if they don't extradite you to the US like they do to Assange. Okay, close bracket. In the midst of their decadence, they continue aggressing the commons, the common goods of nature, especially the mineral wealth, to feed the capitalist accumulation. And in politics, in the face of the decline of the Keynesian state, they appeal to the ideas of the far right. Those that are promoting the far right all over the global south are the capitalists. It's the imperialists as a weapon of politics, of the class war, of the class struggle, rather. And as for ideology, I also want to underscore the decadent imperialism has increased its investments in the media and in the dissemination of neo-fascist ideas. And Gaza, is the biggest symbol of this. However, but as a fifth consequence of this decadence, as has also been said, there is a complete bankruptcy of all the international bodies of the UN system, which was a product of the Second World War. So there is a need that this crisis lead to a reorganization of this network of countries, but also of the people's forces at the international level, because this spectrum of the United Nations, this specter of the UN no longer has the strength or the political representativeness as for Latin America.
As for Latin America, as I am in São Paulo, in the decadent project of capitalism, what are we suffering as a consequence? The project of the imperialist bourgeoisie is simply to recolonize Latin America and get in their hands on our agricultural and mining commodities. This will not generate further development of the productive forces. And what we are saying that in all countries of Latin America, there is large masses of the working members of the working class excluded also from the capitalist production system. Here in Brazil, we have 70,000 workers outside of the productive sphere, because capitalism does not need their workforce anymore, their labor force. And the consequence of this situation is that we see a continuous political instability. It's not about waves, the progressive wave here, and here or there we have some progressive government. What we see in Latin America is political instability. And why? Because no matter who we manage to elect, the government will not be able to build a popular anti-imperialist project for the country. And while we don't have a project, an anti-imperialist project of the people that will consider our economic needs of restructuring the country in order to create jobs and producing food to fight the fact that our peoples are starving, to achieve national sovereignty over the commons of nature, and also to rebuild the unity between the countries of the South. If we do not have such a project, we will not see stability in political terms for Latin America. And back to our great comrade of swimming, exercise, training, and getting prepared for a mass struggle. Thank you, VJ, my comrade.
Obrigado, João Pedro. Great to have you, of course, as well. All of us know that the bravery of the South African Foreign Ministry to take the case against Israel on the grounds of the Genocide Convention to the International Criminal Court was something to behold. The bravery of the South African International Relations Department and so on was quite incredible. And recent statements as well from Minister Naledi Pandor have been extraordinary, talking about aid and so on. I know she's speaking in her personal capacity, because that is, of course, the nicety of these things. But it is a real honor for us, Shannon Ibrahim, for you to come in and talk to us about this report, and also the situation within South Africa and the Global South in general, this new mood in the Global South. It's a real honor, because I know that in your professional capacity, you are, of course, very much part of the International Relations Department or the Foreign Ministry of South Africa. But you are, of course, speaking here in your personal capacity, former journalist, and now, well, an important figure in the South African scene. Shannon Ibrahim, Welcome to No Cold War.
Thank you very much, Vijay, for having me and also for organizing this important webinar. I'd really like to focus on the role of South Africa as one of the leaders of the Global South. As you've alluded to in the very important and excellent document, Hyper-imperialism, we are witnessing a strategic realignment of forces in the international arena. The developing South is very much caught in the middle of the rising global tensions, and we're all experiencing this increasing pushback against the forces that are promoting collective action, international solidarity, and cooperation. So as we all know, the current global order is characterized by widening inequality, and the global economy continues to deliver inequitable and unjust outcomes. Developed countries have selectively opted out of the rules-based system, while they continue to insist that the rules must be implemented by developing countries, even at the cost of providing services to their people. The rise of emerging markets and developing countries over the past 3 decades has, however, been a transformative force in reshaping the dynamics of the evolving international order. South Africa has used every available multilateral space to consistently advance the African agenda and that of the Global South, as well as the cause of progressive internationalism. We've expended major efforts and resources in mobilizing support for Palestine, Western Sahara, and Cuba, especially in the bodies of the developing South, such as NAM, the G77, BRICS, but also at the UN, the G20, and the WTO. South Africa continues to call for the complete transformation of the existing exclusivist, elite, unfair, and archaic institutions of global governance, most particularly that of trade and the financial architecture. South Africa has championed the Global South's call for the cancellation of historical debts, the issuance of new IMF special drawing rights, the expansion of concessional development financing, and the transfer of technology. A key pillar of our foreign policy is to strengthen multilateralism and democratize the UN Security Council so that it can respond timeously to devastating conflicts like the one that we have been witnessing in Gaza. A multipolar world requires multilateral security arrangements, but I think it's important to note that military alliances that divide the world into blocs do not offer the answers to the challenges that we confront and are in fact a dangerous anachronism instead of a source of national or regional security. I would now like to focus on BRICS as an emerging center of power of the Global South. The emergence of BRICS as a strategic alliance over the past decade has redefined the geopolitical landscape, challenging and disrupting traditional global and regional power structures in its attempt to foster a more just world. As your Hyper-imperialism document states, this is the first time in 600 years that there's now a credible economic and political alternative to the domination of the world affairs by northern countries. The rising importance of BRICS is increasingly evident. According to MEG updates, BRICS has officially overtaken the G7 in global GDP. The 5 core members of BRICS contribute 31% of global GDP, while the G7 contributes 30%. And BRICS is expected to contribute over 50% of global GDP by 2030, which may even happen sooner given the impending enlargement of this grouping. And as we have seen when we hosted the BRICS Summit in August, there has been a growing interest by members of the international community to join BRICS. And we have recently welcomed 4 new BRICS members, those being Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia would be the 5th, but that is pending. The BRICS New Development Bank has given emerging economies greater control over lending and greater autonomy over the course of their development. The NDB welcomed Bangladesh, Egypt, the UAE, and Uruguay as members in 2021, positioning the NDP as the preferred global financing mechanism for emerging markets and developing countries. The aim of the NDB being to provide financing in both local and hard currencies, and it is providing significant financial support to build infrastructure. I believe it has approved 80 investment projects in member countries exceeding $30 billion. As BRICS members, we are exploring the option of trading in our local currencies and developing an alternative to the SWIFT banking system, which, as we know, has caused major problems in the international trading system, given the unilateral imposition of sanctions. There is an overwhelming impulse among emerging economies to change the currency situation of international payments and lending practices from the hegemonic US dollar to local currencies. I would now like to look at how the Global South is turning to multilateral mechanisms and institutions to hold countries accountable for their violations of international law, and also specifically the significance of the Global South taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. So first, I should mention that South Africa took Israel to the ICJ 20 years ago in 2004 over the building of the apartheid wall. The court ruled that Israel must put an immediate end to the violation of its international obligations by ceasing work on the construction of the wall and dismantling those parts of the structure that were situated in the occupied Palestinian territory. As we've come to expect, Israel ignored the ruling with impunity and expanded the wall. So what this really demonstrates is how international organizations have failed to compel states to abide by international law. This is really a very serious problem. In January this year, we saw South Africa take Israel to the ICJ for violating its obligations under the Geneva Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in Gaza. The South African government also laid charges of genocide against Netanyahu at the ICC. Now, this move, I really want to emphasize, is really significant on South Africa's part, as it's the first time that a country of the South has brought a critical issue of international peace and security to the ICJ and launched a frontal challenge against a country of the North. South Africa has actually approached the court twice in the first 2 months of this year to protect the civilians of Gaza, and I think it makes us proud to be South African. On January 26, the court delivered its order on South Africa's request for provisional measures and found plausible evidence that Israel was conducting and is conducting a genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza, and this has been a major victory for the Global South. The court ordered that Israel shall take measures within its power to prevent all acts of genocide and to take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. Now, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have said that Israel has failed to take even the bare minimum steps to comply. I think many of us would even go further than that. Israel has continued bombardment, ground offensives, the use of starvation as a weapon of war by preventing the delivery of urgent humanitarian aid. I found this very interesting, that the number of trucks being allowed to enter Gaza has decreased by 40% since the ICJ ruling, according to OCHA. And as a result, Gaza is hurtling towards a famine of Israel's making. I found particularly disturbing the Flower Massacre on February 28th, which, as we know, killed 112 people and wounded over 750. This was absolutely indisputable evidence of Israel's genocidal campaign against the people of Gaza. As the UN Secretary General said, those people in the north of Gaza had not received food aid for over a week. And those people were standing on the street waiting for the food trucks when, as they approached, Israeli tanks and warplanes started to bomb them and attack them. And the most incredible was to hear that these tanks then drove over the bodies of the dead Palestinians waiting for food. It's reprehensible. And I just have to ask the question, where is this notion that we came up with years ago of the responsibility to protect? Each state has the responsibility to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And this applies even more so to an occupying power. But this type of impunity just carries on, and it has gone on for too long. So what we can gather from this is that legal remedies are important, but clearly insufficient, and the international community must now consider other measures to end the unlawful actions of the Israeli government. So I'll say in conclusion that what there really is an urgent need to build a broad international solidarity movement to respond to humanitarian crises and conflicts. We need to advocate for the type of multilateralism that will create greater inclusivity, to reduce inequality and promote equitable, sustainable development. We also urgently need to hold countries of the North responsible for their violations of international law. And when we come together as a collective and create an overarching strategy, I think we won't even believe the power that we can wield as the global South. And as the great revolutionary leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro, said, we must unite today to build the tomorrow that we yearn for, to vindicate the always excluded, and to rescue faith in humanity. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Shannon. That was just terrific. And it was a demonstration effect of why all of us look to South Africa, to Pretoria, to your office in particular, for leadership here, as we feel occasionally demoralized despite the massive demonstrations around the world. Just because there are changing tides in the world doesn't mean the tides change swiftly enough. As both Loki and you demonstrate, Gaza is a point of pain in this shifting order. We're going to move from South Africa across the Indian Ocean to Sri Lanka, which is a front line in the new Cold War between the United States and China. Sri Lanka, of course, one of the early countries to emerge out of colonialism. Sri Lanka with its own history, its own dynamic, but its own position, Dharini, as a country suffocated by the International Monetary Fund in the middle of all this. We're very happy to be joined from Sri Lanka by Dharini Rajasingham Stenanayaka. Dharini is an anthropologist, a very serious scholar, but for our purposes, one of the important voices within Sri Lanka, speaking the truth about her country and for her country. Dharini, all yours from No Cold War.
Okay, thank you very much, Vijay, for that generous introduction. And also, I'm very happy to be here and for having shared the document on hyper-imperialism, which I think is very important. My comments actually would be more along the lines of trying to sort of deepen and maybe broaden the analysis, which I completely agree with, given that there's different perspectives from different regions of the world. Broadly, the analysis of the military business industrial complex is very important. And what would be nice to see is a connection to the environmental crisis that we are seeing, the climate crisis. Of course, as an anthropologist, I am fairly skeptical about the Anthropocene climate catastrophe discourse. I think there needs to be much more nuance in that. But still, the military business industrial complex and the war machines, a huge amount of pollution that it generates, by far the most by any entity in the world, somehow does not feature in sort of COP22, the COP analyses and the UN climate narrative. So that would be interesting if the connections could be made through the report. Also, we are in I suppose we are in sort of difficult and dark times at this time, and there's a need for hope. So I just thought that looking at the long durée structures of global power shifts from the north to the south, from the south to the north, that's ongoing now. Right now, we have a power shift from the north to the south as much as from the west to the east. And this is, of course, causing a great deal of turbulence. But world systems theorists like André Gunderfanker, Samir Amin have talked about the need to reorient, and that for most of human history, Asia led the world in terms of ideas, of innovation, of technology, etc., except for the last maybe 300 years or so when Euro-America came to dominate the world. And this power shift is historically inevitable. And that, I think, because these are civilizational powers. I mean, you talk about China and India. They've been around for a very long time. And that is cause also for hope in some sense, because the world before your American hegemony was a fundamentally multipolar world, and we are returning to that space, as it were. But to distract from this power shift, I think we're also in the process, in the midst of a lot of culture wars. So you have, all the sort of identity politics and happening to distract from the sort of economic issues that are also much more pertinent. So in any case, what I'm going to say is really in relation to what seems to be a new hybrid economic war on the global south and China, Belt and Road Initiative, in the form of US dollar debt colonialism, neocolonialism, one might call it. So we're back to that circle. Despite the fact that there is this other confrontation, Cold War between a new Cold War between the West and China, as it were, and this hybrid economic Cold War has put about 50 odd countries into debt traps and default. They're near default or in default, and also, and these are, while China is blamed for the dollar debt trap, it's actually Eurobond debt that has accumulated and caused the default. So, and with this, along with this default, there's also been the IMF is involved in sort of mission and mandate creep. So I'm going to just sort of describe some of the IMF's recent programs, and that is there are sort of three pillars to deepening the Eurobond debt trap, and that is to get countries that have defaulted to keep borrowing from the same sort of vulture funds like BlackRock that have debt trap countries, to further deepen the debt trap. And the IMF is also mission creeping into domestic debt restructuring, whereas it's supposed to focus on external debt. Then, of course, the usual austerity measures and taxation to shrink the economies, and that also deepens the debt. And then, of course, there is a fire sale of strategic assets like resources that we some already talked about, but also infrastructure, energy, transport, and strategic lands, etc. So there are a lot of these global south countries that are caught in which are in very geostrategic locations. And Sri Lanka, of course, sits on these, not only at the center of the Indian Ocean trade routes, energy and trade routes, but also undersea or submarine data cable routes. And actually there was a breach. There was three cables were cut recently, and the sort of, that's also part of the emerging hybrid Cold War. And it's a proxy war on China, and with a lot of propaganda and a sort of blame game, but also there's the staging of what we call exogenous economic shocks through sort of staged terror attacks, fronting ISIS narratives or assassinations, regime change operations, as well as the staging of climate catastrophes. And at this stage, we also know of directed energy weapons programs which enable the staging of storms, hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, all kinds of climate disasters, which enable then disaster capitalism, the moving in under the sort of guise of humanitarianism, sometimes to set up military bases. So that is also sort of ongoing at this time. And also, so the hybrid economic dimension also pertains to data gaming. There are a lot of cyber hacks. The data is being manipulated, and so there's a need for, I think, in terms of this, the work that the Tricontinental Institute is doing, and all the people on this panel, in some sense, is to look at how these debt trap countries can all work together, because as many people observe, the global South is fragmented, the global North is very united. Now you have what's called the Paris Club, or the Colonial Club de Paris, which is involved in ensuring that countries always pay back the debt rather than default. And some of us have asked for a permanent default on the private debt and debt cancellation. But the IMF is there to ensure that these predatory Eurobond traders who charge high interest and are de-risked, so when the risk materializes, they have already made their money, but they're still asking for the IMF to get more money to pay off their bondholders. So it would be good if y'all could convene the global South countries that are in this debt trap to come up with united solutions, because if all the countries, all the South countries that are in the IMF, bailout business could come together and say, well, we're all going to default permanently and not pay back the Eurobond debt. We'll pay back multilateral and bilaterals, but we're not, and then also move on to de-dollarizing, joining the BRICS, the New Development Bank, all of that, alternatives, because there's also sort of fear psychosis that if you even think about an alternative to the IMF, there's going to be all these exogenous economic shocks staged, and as we know, there's a long history behind that. Make the economy scream is a old phrase of that was used back in 1973 to bring down the first socialist head of state, Chile. And that has been done consistently over the years in Argentina, particularly. Argentina is again one of the countries in one of these debt traps. So I would suggest that I would conclude by suggesting that it might be a good idea for the Tricontinental Institute to try to get together, and I've sort of also proposed a manifesto for debt justice that be generated, just like the Communist Manifesto way back then, because we are in a new round of neocolonialism and this hybrid economic war on the global South and China's BRI. Thank you.
Well, you heard it here first. Dharini has volunteered to write a draft of a manifesto against the debt trap diplomacy. She is evoking and channeling Fidel Castro at the debt conference held in Havana, Cuba in 1985, an event now considerably forgotten, but here it is, no more debt. You're with the No Cold War webinar on the text Hyper-imperialism. This text is available online in English, Portuguese, Chinese, Spanish, and so on, other languages to come. This entire webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube very soon. There'll also be clips on social media. Please follow No Cold War on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and so on, so that you can help us amplify the clips that will come out of this very, very important webinar. We're coming to about the last half an hour, 40 minutes of this webinar, this rally really on this text. And I'm very happy that our next speaker is going to be Dr. or Professor Chen and Fu. Professor Chen and Fu was the leader for many years of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, an important scholar, a Marxist intellectual. He also is the chief editor of World Marxist Review. We're going to hear from Professor Chen and Fu in Chinese. Don't forget to select interpretation below. So, Dr. Chen and Fu, it's all yours now.
各位好，非常高兴参加本次研讨
Hello,
会。
it's a great
三
pleasure
大
for me
泽社
to
会研
participate
究
in this
所
webinar.
推出
The
关于计
Tricontinental
划帝
Institute
国
for
主义
Social
的研究
Research
成果
has released its
十分
research
重要，
results on
很有新意，
hyper-imperialism, which is
是
very
马
important
克
and
思列
innovative.
宁毛泽东
For the
主
Marxist-Leninist
义在
Maoist
21世纪的
ideology,
重要发展。
it's a significant
我
development
赞同
of the
其
21st
基本观
century.
点。下面
I
我
agree
谈一
with
些
its
看
basic
法。
viewpoints.
第
Now
一，
I would like
当
to
今世
share
界
some of my
面临
thoughts.
百年未有之
First,
大变
the
局，
world is
经
undergoing
济全
changes
球
unseen
化，
in a century.
政治多极化，
Economic globalization,
文化
political
多样化潮流
multipolarity,
不
and
可逆
cultural
转，
diversification
各
are
国之间
irreversible.
依存度
Countries
加深，
see a
国
deepening
际经济秩
interdependence.
序合
A
理化
more
越来越
reasonable
成为大
international
多数东
economic
方
and
国家
political order
和
is
南方
becoming
国
a
家
common
共
pursuit
同追
for
求
most
的目标，
Oriental and Global South
为
countries.
国际体系转型
For the
提供了需
transformation
求
of
和
the
动力。
international system, this
近
provides
年
the
来，
demand and
国
impetus.
际力量
In
对
recent
比
years,
正在
the
发生前
balance of
所未有
international
的积极
power
变化。
has seen
新兴市
unprecedented
场国
positive
家
changes.
和77
Emerging
国集
markets
团
and group of
成员
77
国等广
members,
大发展中
among
国
other
家
developing
群
countries,
体
are
性崛起，
changing the global
正在
political
改
and
变
economic
全球
landscape.
政治经济版图。世界多极化
The
和国
trend
际经
towards
济政治
multipolarity
秩
and
序
a
合
more
理化
reasonable
大
international
势
economic
难易。
and political order
以西方
is
发达国家为
unstoppable.
主导的全
The
球
West
治理体
dominated
系
global
出
governance
现变
system
革迹象，
indicates signs of
但争
change.
夺全球治理和国际规则制
But the
定主导
competition
权
for
的较
global
量
governance and
十分
dominance in
激
setting
烈。
international
西
rules
方发
is
达国家
intense.
在经济、科技、
Western developed
政治、军事
countries'
上的优势
advantage
地
on
位尚未
economy,
改变，
technology, politics, and
因而
military is still
更加
there.
公正合理的国际
For
经
more
济
fair
秩
and
序
reasonable
的形
international
成
economic and political
和
order
变
to
革
take
依
shape,
然任重
there's
道
still a
远。
long way to go.
第二，国际
Second,
经济秩序合理化的
a
实现
reasonable
关系
international
到新
economic
的
order is
国
crucial
际
for a
整
new
个
international
格
and
局的构
the
建，
international
关
landscape,
系到
and for many
众多国
countries,
家，特别是弱小国家
especially weak and poor
利益
nations,
的维
to
护。
protect their
美
interests.
国党派纷争
Partisan
使得国
disputes
家
in
治
the
理
US
能力
have
削弱，
weakened its governance
试图
capacity,
称霸世界，
making its
勒
attempt
索
to
国际。
dominate the world
反观
un
中国、俄
unattainable.
罗斯等国家，通
In
过不断
contrast,
发展
countries
变革
like
增
China
强
and
自身的
Russia
实力，
have
在
been
国际舞台
developing
上
and
的
reforming
作
for greater
锐意
strength,
凸显。
and their
国
roles
际
on the
政治力
international
量的
stage
分
are
化组
increasingly
合，促
prominent.
进了世界发展
International
的
political
多极化，
forces, thanks
对
to
于
their
遏制
restructuring,
经济霸
facilitate
权主义
the multipolar
和
development
强
of
权
the
政
world.
治。
For
这
curbing
个
economic
推进
hegemonism
国际
and power
经济秩序的合
politics
理
and
化具有
working
重要
towards
的
a
意义。
more reasonable
不
international
过，世界
economic
经
order,
济复苏势
this
头
is of
依
great
然脆弱，
significance.
全球贸
However,
易
the
和投
momentum
资
of
低迷，
global economic
大宗
recovery
商品
remains
价格持
fragile.
续波动，
Global trade and
引发
investment
国
are
际金融
sluggish,
危机
and
的深
commodity
层次
prices continue
矛
to
盾仍未
fluctuate.
解决。
Deep-seated
一些国
problems
家政
causing
策
international
内部
financial
倾向
crises
加重，
have yet to be
保
resolved.
护主义抬头，
Some
逆
countries are
全
leaning
球化
towards
思潮
inward-looking policies,
暗
protectionism
流
is
涌
on the
动。
rise, and there is a
第
backlash
三，
against
反思
globalization.
新帝国主义或者叫极化
Third, countering the new imperialism and enabling a more reasonable international economic order is a long-term and gradual process. Regarding the opportunities and obstacles in this effort, it requires first, strengthening economic quality and mutually beneficial cooperation, developing diverse currencies and reforming the IMF. Doing so helps boost global economic balance. Second, respecting and upholding the world's diversity entails respecting all countries and people's cultural differences, protecting the diversity of world civilizations, and promoting exchanges and mutual learning among them. Third, leveraging the leading role of the UN, strengthening the positive role of regional organizations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and other international economic organizations to make them more influential. Fourth, adhering to the basic principles of international law and international order, improving international law, reforming international legal institutions such as the International Court of Justice, and ensuring international judges are selected and appointed with more transparency and openness. Fourth, given the economic globalization dominated by the US monopoly capitalism, class struggles remain sharp worldwide. US Democrats and Republicans represent American monopoly capitalist groups' fundamental interests. This is still the case. They safeguard American-style capitalist system whose nature remains unchanged. People from all countries must see clear the truth about Western democracy, unite to oppose political, cultural, military, and cyber hegemonism. These efforts are required to establish a new international political and economic order and build a community with a shared future for mankind. In the 21st century, the struggle against Western imperialism and NATO is the principal contradiction in the world. The global working class and people and all left-wing forces must see clear this international big picture, formulate domestic and foreign strategies and tactics accordingly, work in solidarity for the international united front, and engage in long-term effective struggles. Fifth, China, being a developing country, works on peaceful rise and has achieved remarkable success. As the US-led Western countries shifts their strategic focus to Asia, how China deals with the complex environment for its own sustained development and for a more reasonable international economic order is an important issue. Therefore, China needs to propose solutions and take actions. First, work with the Group of 77 and other developing countries to deepen sincere cooperation and help small countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America uphold their interests. Second, leverage emerging countries' momentum of adjustment to push the international economic and political order for transformation. Third, keep to the path of peaceful development, work on the Belt and Road Initiative, BRICS, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for cooperative development and for admitting new members. Fourth, actively respond to a cool war and a new Cold War, the global fight against COVID-19 originating from the US, Russia's counter-actions against Western countries with its special military operation, Israel escalating its invasion of Gaza Strip, among other major changes in international economic and political landscape. Fifth, promote the RMB regionalization and internationalization, establish a de-dollarization global economic new order. Sixth, leverage China's quasi-central position and role in the world economic system, including building self-reliant technology chains, industrial chains, supply chains, and value chains. And also, I want to emphasize, lastly, By around 2050, China is expected to transition from its current quasi-central status to become one of the top central countries and developed countries in the world economic system. This indicates China's economic and technological strength. But when it comes to its national character and international role, well, we can say that China definitely would not be an imperialist or hegemonic country that oppresses and exploits other nations. China and other BRICS countries in the existing world economic system are pushing for equal cooperation and mutual benefit, delivering positive effects. So in a sense, China and other BRICS countries in the new imperialism or hyper-imperialism dominated world economic system represents a fair, open, and new economic subsystem within it. So this is the end of my speech. Thank you all.
Okay. Okay. Well, there's a good reason why Professor Chen En-Pu is one of the leading intellectual voices within China, and you got a little taste of that. As I said, he's the editor of the World Marxist Review. We're going to move on now. This is the 100th anniversary, birth anniversary of Amilcar Cabral, the founder and leader of the PAIGC that led the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau and in Cape Verde. Very happy to have with us the Central Committee member from the PAIGC, as well as executive member of the West African People's Organizations, Imani Na Umoja. It's a very important time in the Sahel and in West Africa, given the set of anti-French imperialist coups that took place in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and then in Guinea as well, new federations, new groupings, and so on. So very happy to welcome Imani to No Cold War to talk to us about the situation from that perspective. Imani, I know you're there. Look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you so very much, my brother and comrade Vijay. And thank you to all of those who took the time, the energy to do the research, to have the meetings to compile the results of the research, to exchange ideas on the best way to publish these results. So that those of us who want to change the world have more of a historical materialistic analysis of where we came from and where we are right now. The strength of our enemy and the strength of all those of us who are revolutionary and progressive. I would like to dedicate our comments to the people of Gaza, and especially to those who coordinate in the resistance against the Zionists. We're in the century of Amilcar Cabral. This year marks the 100th anniversary of his birth. And we want you to know that we can, that we have been allies with the Palestinian people since the glorious armed struggle in the 1960s. But right now, because of regime changes, we have an imposed, illegal, unconstitutional president, so-called president, who just came back from occupied Palestine a few days ago. While the Zionists are committing genocide against our people, he wants to go shake hands with the Zionists who are doing this. And he came back with some Zionist tear gas to try to contain us, but he won't be successful. In our opinion, from our perspective, the the disease of imperialism, hyper-imperialism, which has made our humanity rotten, which will only be cured by the critical organization of the 8 billion people, the 8 billion humans on this planet. And this treatment must include political, ideological coordination of revolutionary and progressive parties, workers' unions, which is why we're honored to be here representing not only the PIGC, but also the West African People's Organization, WAPO, which is a part of Pan-Africanism today for Africa. Which for its part is a part of the International People's Assembly. So it's an honor to be working along with the International People's Assembly and the Tricontinental Research Institute. The ALBA movements and the Simon Bolivar Institute of Venezuela, of ALBA, of Africa. So now that we have these categories, these groupings that our comrades have given to us, it gives us more data to make more of our analysis on how to move forward. But we understand that they're general, they need to be all the time revised because dialectics teaches that everything changes all the time. For example, the category of the 10 strongly sovereign-seeking countries. You say you use as criteria the way the country votes, what organization it belongs to. Is it friends to the United Nations Charter? But you also looked at the category, the criteria of regime change. Are they target of regime change? So if we were to use the criteria of regime change or targets of regime change, then surely the PIGS party should be included there because it's been a victim of regime change just even recently. But of course, I'm sure you would base it upon the state. And so since the state has an imposed neocolonial so-called president, then we understand. But we understand and really appreciate these categories. Even if you look at the categories of what you call the global north, the global north imperialist, the global north independent countries like China, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela, Vietnam, Laos. One thing that we'll see common here is that each of these countries have a revolutionary party. And with the revolutionary party, they're doing constant systematic political education. In fact, some of them, they say that the guarantee of the revolution is the party. We agree with them. And the other thing that we will see is that they're in coordination with other revolutionary parties and economic organizations. So there we can extract a conclusion that to defeat hyper-imperialism, which we would defeat, it's fundamental to have organization and coordination. this guiding revolutionary consciousness in practice. That is, say that constant political education is a prerequisite. But then we also have to have technological and technique training. If you look at these countries we mentioned, China, Russia, they are constantly, because of their constant doing technical training, the technology is not only catching up with imperialists, but it's overpassing imperialist technological advances. As you pointed out in your study, the comrades who spoke before us, they pointed out that in the study on hyper-imperialism, in the area of finances and production, they're here too now, the non-imperialist countries are overtaking the imperialist countries. We're producing more. And the finances of the imperialist countries are falling. While ours is growing, as our comrade before me mentioned, here we have some upcoming blocks that are becoming stronger, such as BRICS Plus. And we're de-dollarizing, getting away from the dollar. And we all know that when the US dollar falls, the US capitalists will fall. In terms of the military, the study showed that how much the imperialist countries have advanced with their military capability. But we too are growing. We're developing military. And I would like to remind those who are viewing that Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro reminded us, with all the nuclear warheads that exist in the world today, only 0.5% is necessary to wipe out all the agriculture in the world. So it's kind of like a checkmate. On the other hand, if we look at the military of the imperialist countries, we have to look at the level of consciousness. For example, the armies of England, France, US, Canada, which are projected as being strong, having millions of soldiers, if you do a sociological, cultural analysis of those soldiers, you will find that most of them are not patriotic at all. They were unemployed, couldn't find a job. So they followed the propaganda. Join this army, they'll take care of you, be all you can be, they'll pay for your college, you won't go to war, you'll have a nice retirement. Then once they get you to sign the contract, you're their property. And we become their property, they say, okay, you gotta go to Iraq, you gotta go to Syria, you gotta go fight. So most of them would try to escape. But those who don't escape, they give them drugs and put them in a tank to tell them to go fight. And when they're inside the tank, they think they're playing video games, just like they used to do all their life. But on the other hand, if you look at the soldiers of the socialist countries like Vietnam, like Cuba, like China, etc., you find that they're patriotic. They're fighting for humanity. They're fighting for their homeland. Their consciousness in front of the gun. So here again, we want to give emphasis to the role of consciousness. The consciousness of our people throughout the world is growing. Even inside of the capitalist countries. I'm not saying capitalism, but the people inside of those countries. Because capitalism doesn't have any consciousness at all, doesn't have any human consciousness at all. They're anti-human, but they depend on people living like robots. Not just in the armies, but in their institutions. So one of our key areas is to raise the conscious level of those people. You pointed out in your research the role that the imperialism are using with the media and even the social. But on the other hand, we have alternative media. We have Telesur TV. We have the CGTN in China. We have Pan-African TV in Ghana. And we have initiatives which need to be followed to have coordination among our radio stations. So the key is organization. Vanguard organizations can make key roles in revolutions. But to maintain the revolution, to continue the revolution, it depends on the mass organization of conscious people. As Amir Kakabral teaches us, Mao Zedong also taught us, and all revolutionary teachers us, Fidel, we have to live among our people, do as they do, learn from our people, and help to bring our people to higher levels. But to make sure that our people are organized in parties. Because again, the party is the guarantee of the revolution. As I close, I'm reminded by Vladimir Lenin in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, that while imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, Sajavo Kwame Nkrumah, in his book, Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, makes it clear to us that neocolonialism is the last stage of imperialism. After the last stage is socialism. As was said in the Communist Manifesto, a new world is possible. We have a world to win. So we thank you and we're ready for the revolution and ready to continue working with you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Imani Na Umoja from the PAIGC and the West African People's Organization. Yes, after hyper-imperialism, either the common ruin of contending classes, as Marx and Engels wrote in the manifesto, or socialism. We're going to move to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, where there is a socialist project underway. We're going to listen to Carlos Ron. Carlos Ron is, of course, also the vice minister in the foreign ministry, but he's not speaking in that capacity. He is speaking in his capacity as the president of the Instituto Simón Bolívar, the Simón Bolívar Institute. Carlos, this is, of course, just a few months after the 200th anniversary of that infernal Monroe Doctrine imposed upon Latin America, the Yankees' claws, as they say, the talons of the eagle. Carlos Ron, Welcome to No Cold War.
Well, thank you, VJ, and thank you, everybody. Gracias a todos por esta oportunidad.
Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. I'm talking from Caracas, Venezuela. So I'm very happy to be talking about this study on hyper-imperialism that characterizes imperialism in our current days. It's very important for us to have a clearer view about the kind of imperialism we are confronting. That's why I would like to dedicate this part to speak about the hybrid warfare that is key in what is this discussed in the hyper-imperialism study. Given the example of Venezuela, the hybrid war against Venezuela has been waged for 25 years when the Bolivarian Revolution began and President Hugo Chavez proposed a political project that reestablished Venezuela's sovereignty over its natural resources and foreign policy. When Venezuela was accused in 2015 executive order by President Obama of being an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, many people found it laughable. A small country like Venezuela cannot be a threat against the world's leading military power. But the key is that in that other part of the phrase, it is a threat to the foreign policy, not because Venezuela's foreign policy is designed to attack or imbalance the United States, but because the hyper-empire cannot accept deviation it is designed for the region or the world. An independent Venezuela put at risk the energy security of the United States, but a Venezuela that also opened up to the world and allowed Chinese, Russian, or Iranian investment, or a Venezuela that also established a method of relations between the countries of the region, not based on the rules of Washington's free market, but on cooperation, complementarity, and solidarity, thus allowing other nations in the region to reduce their dependence on the United States, was without any doubt a threat. Ever since the Vietnam War, which was the first massively televised conflict in the eyes of the US public, imperialism knew that it had to shift to a hybrid strategy of waging war and promoting regime change, constructing a narrative in the media, using economic measures as a form of coercion, employing methods of diplomatic isolation, etc., and the financing of internal destabilization. All this was applied during the government of President Chavez. A coup in 2002 constructed through the media that mobilized the political opposition into an ambush to justify a military uprising, a lockout of the oil industry to bankrupt the economy, the attempt to apply the democratic charter against Venezuela through the Organization of American States, and the continued funding through US aid, the National Endowment for Democracy, and other non-governmental organizations for destabilizing actions. President Chavez died in 2013, and hyper-imperialism kicks in, redoubling all its previous efforts. At this moment, against the Bolivarian Revolution led by President Nicolás Maduro, there are 930 illegal coercive measures. That is, contrary to international law, where access to financial operations has been blocked, assets in the order of $30 billion have been seized, the entry of medicines and food into the country has been blocked as well. But at the same time, and in order to meet some of these objectives, someone else was recognized as president, creating a kind of parallel government to diplomatically isolate President Maduro. Some NGOs were also allowed to finance acts of violence and insurrection in the streets to allow attempts of invasions of the country through hired mercenaries. Between 2018 and 19, along with the country's ban on being able to market its oil and gas or gold, whatever, There was an attempt of assassination against the president using explosive drones. There was a cyber attack that left the country without power for days and even weeks in some regions. A reward was offered for the capture of President Maduro, as in the old Wild West movies. The United States openly supported a failed attempt at a military uprising and constantly threatened Venezuela with a military opposition in this hybrid war. But now, what is our counteroffensive from the global south? Now, if it is a tremendous work of hyper-imperialism has taught us anything, it is that throughout this historical transit, the Uruguayan poet Mario Benedetti said, "The South also exists. Our peoples are not passive actors of the face of the hyper-militarism." In Venezuela, under both Presidents Chavez and Maduro, every attempt to encapsulate and suffocate the Bolivarian revolution has opened up by deepening democratic participation. It was, for example, a national constituent assembly that created the legal mechanism known as the anti-blockade law, throughout which Venezuela has been recovering economically, and today it can not only point to the highest percentage of economic growth in Latin America in 2023, but also the fact that 97% of the food is being produced within the country and there is no need to be imported. Those are signs of independence. Venezuela also became a key player in the creation of a new order in the world, which must be multipolar. Venezuela is promoting the group of countries friends of the Charter of the United States, which has been mentioned in this work, which is a reiteration of multilateralism, peace, diplomacy, and respect for international law. The member countries of this group, which will meet again in Caracas in May, have aligned themselves in their opposition to the supposed rules-based order that are nothing more than rules imposed by a hyper-imperialism trying to ignore the principles of the United Nations Charters. Venezuela has won the hybrid war. Today, almost all member countries of the United Nations formally recognize the government elected by the people of Venezuela, the government of President Nicolás Maduro, and if they do not formally recognize it, they deal with it informally, as does the United States itself. Today, the Venezuelan people have still summoned through the assemblies for the 7 transformations that President Maduro has called to continue building their insertion in the new geopolitical order. And Venezuela aspires to keep pushing in the elections this year to continue with our revolution. Venezuela is already a member of the BRICS and aspires to fully join it in a short time. Venezuela believes in the research for the de-dollarization and a new mechanism of greater unity among peoples under a principle of fair trade. Hyper-imperialism is a powerful, terrible, overwhelming force that, if not stopped, will extinguish life on the planet. But there is a South that exists, that sees itself more and more, and that holds all the hope of the peoples of the earth. A South that has not given up and will survive until it wins. Thank you very much.
That is a great lesson. The South also exists. El Sur también existe. The line from Mario Benedetti. Beautiful. Thanks a lot. Carlos Ron, president of the Instituto Simón Bolívar. Well, we've reached our final speaker, my favorite speaker. We're going to now have Jody Evans of Code Pink. Well, Code Pink was founded in 2002, 22 years ago, to lift awareness and build a coalition, a big enough wave within the United States to stop the hyper-imperialist machine, which was at the time conducting the illegal war against the Iraqi people. Jody, one war, another war, yet another war. You are always walking the halls of the US Congress, banging on the door, telling them to awaken their conscience. I watched you last week, videos of you circulating along with your colleague Medea Benjamin, trying to force US lawmakers to take a reasonable position on the complicity in the genocide against the Palestinians. It's such a great honor to have you here. Jody Evans of Code Pink.
Thank you, Vijay. And it has been so wonderful to listen to all of your voices from around the world. Very nourishing. As I say, good morning from the belly of the beast, or should I say monster. Yes, as Vijay said, I come after a week in the halls of Congress with my Code Pink team, witness to the rot at the core of the empire. Our intent was to stop the destruction of Gaza. The issue in Congress is a request to Biden to effect a ceasefire and end the bombing by their puppet Israel. We were also there desperately trying to stop the 14 billion more Biden wants to send to Israel, and our final request to refund UNRWA. At Code Pink, we really want the US to recognize Palestine and end the 75 years of Israel's Zionist oppression and occupation, but there's no one in Congress carrying that request. Congress has a bunker mentality that is narrow in thinking, yet full of narcissism and hubris and bold violence. There are 435 members of Congress, 100 members in the Senate. Only 77 can even say ceasefire, and not even 20 have committed to say no to more money. The majority are white, male, and old. The Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party, known as the CPC, is majority owned by AIPAC, the most powerful lobbying group in the Western world, American Israeli Political Affairs Committee. A member and leader in getting the money to Israel, Congressman Richie Torres, a self-described Afro-Puerto Rican fighter from the Bronx. As he was walking for a vote, I asked him how he could not call for a ceasefire, and why was he sending more money as he watched a genocide unfolding where children were starving to death. He was trying to ignore my question and walk past me as quickly as he could. But he had this huge smug on his face, and so I asked him, why are you smiling while I'm asking you about a genocide? And he turned to me and said with force, because you're a buffoon. To which I responded, who is the buffoon? He ran away. Congressman Brian Donald seemed happy to engage in what he called a conversation, as long as he had the upper hand and I listened to his lies without interrupting. Hamas, he said, engaged in unspeakable war crimes on October 7th and continues to flagrantly violate the Geneva Conventions using human shields. This can end if Hamas surrenders. They refuse, so Israel has the responsibility to obliterate Hamas. This congressman is Black, raised in New York, but represents a conservative Southern Florida district and being considered as Trump's vice president. Congressman Brian Mass from Florida told us, do you know where we stand on terrorists? We stand on their throats. And Congressman Fleischman from Tennessee said he wants to wipe Palestine off the earth. Members would tell us off camera how frightened they were of AIPAC. Now that the terminology of ceasefire has been totally co-opted and weaponized by Biden and Harris, more members are willing to say it, but it has lost any meaning, as Biden just says things to appease with no intention of doing anything in any way to help Palestinians, even as he pays a high price with the voters and the people of the world. He just doesn't care. Progressive Democrats in Congress are lost in a panic between wanting to please their voters and AIPAC at the same time. Others are just happy to strut their full support of violence for their voters. Both totally missing that the US bipartisan foreign policy elites are unanimous in their support of Israeli expansion. They need Israel as the Western flank against Asia. Those who see themselves as representing the needs of the people, known as the Squad, are also being targeted by AIPAC, yet Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, and Cori Bush had the courage to wear a keffiyeh to the State of the Union and held signs, "Stop sending bombs" and "Lasting ceasefire now." One of our most disturbing meetings was with Congressman Rosa DeLauro, who had just returned from Israel and came from a meeting with Blinken and others in the White House. She spoke with full colonial mentality. The US will decide who the good Palestinians are, who we will put in charge and tell what to do. She declared Hamas is gone. In explaining to us what was next, it was the same playbook as Iraq and Afghanistan. Take US tax dollars, create a puppet government. The US, in this case, and Israel, controls and dismantle anything that was infrastructure from the past, which creates a constant resistance, which creates a never-ending need for more money, for more weapons from US taxpayers. It was also depressing to see the number of women and people of color who have become the most ferocious defenders of the genocide. No one more ferocious than Victoria Nuland, who, thank goodness, left her position at the State Department, but only after managing to fully disrupt any semblance of peace globally. When they are not talking about more money for Israel, they are intent on getting Ukraine another $75 billion before Russia invades all of Europe, or in Biden's case, until the election is over. And I argued with many members of Congress, both sides of the House, who insist China is invading Taiwan by 2025 and has missiles pointed at every US city. They must wage war on them first. They speak emboldened by the $1.5 trillion they spend on weapons and war each year, and their control of 75% of the weapons in the world, including the largest nuclear arsenal they're willing to use and insanely believe they can win wars with. Witness the fractured political farce in Washington carrying out an unabashed 18th and 19th century style genocidal rampage on the people of Palestine. To the horror of a majority of the voters, both the farce and the genocide. More and more are aware they do not live in a democracy, there is no one at the wheel, and they are headed off a cliff. A cloud of despair hangs over the heads of anyone in the US still thinking or feeling, and yes, most of them are robots. The toxic waste dump and circus that is Congress is a reflection of the evisceration of the education system, a media that is just a propaganda machine, and the war economy culture that most citizens are slave to, that has little or no connection to the needs of life. The electoral system is a $4 trillion industry that sucks money away from the needs of people into a circus of faux democracy, distracting people from investing themselves in anything of real value to the health of the country, their communities, or their own lives. Congress itself lost in its own dance of accomplishing nothing, all while the state, the loose cabal that represents the needs of the elite, only wants one thing: the survival of the empire at any and all costs, poisoning the world as it has poisoned itself and sucking all that is healthy or beautiful of life with it. The world saw how it works at the UN vote to stop the genocide. The one hand up in veto, it gets what it wants. All the rules are rigged in its favor. Almost everyone at the mercy of its needs, except for those who live with their lives in resistance. The monarchy of the US rules the world. The people are starving. The global resistance is growing as the court is debauched, insular, and stupid. The image of Biden eating ice cream cone while discussing a genocide, a perfect image of let them eat cake. For the world and for the people in the US, there is no victor in the US elections. The curtains have been pulled back for all to see. The emperor has no clothes. Now how to respond. We are watching a socialist education in flash times. Those I am in the streets with are learning so fast. They are willing to not accept the options they are offered and will not engage with the systems they see are broken, even if the next step is not clear right now. They are heartened by global outrage. They are learning from it and emboldened by it. feel encouraged from those they witness abroad, beginning with the Palestinians, but including South Africans and all the other countries who have joined in resistance. The activists can feel the violence with impunity that is their hyper-imperialist government. Many speak about empires dying, and the witness of this one dying is horrific, as it flings its claws in every direction, willing to take everyone and everything down with it. But those in the streets are not flinching and moving forward into the unknown together. The comradeship is beautiful. It is what nourishes our broken hearts. The breadth of support is across social strata. People are learning from each other, old and young. Cultures are weaving. The skills of care, regeneration, and renewal of life are growing inside the movements. The connective tissue is weaving a strong bond of resistance. Onward to socialism and peace.
Jody Evans, professor of the University of the Streets. As the French used to say, Jody, some time ago, sous les pavés, la plage, or underneath the paving stones, the beach. We can only imagine and dream of another world. We can only fight to fulfill that dream. You've been with us for this rather long webinar based on this text from Tricontinental and Global South Insights, Hyper-imperialism, a dangerous, decadent new stage. We've had a wonderful, wonderful range of speakers. Before I leave you, I want to first thank our co-sponsors, Alba Movimentos, Pan-Africanism Today, the International Strategy Center, the Instituto Simon Bolivar, Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Each of them contributed in a different and important way to the making of this webinar. I also want to thank Pilar Troya for her team of translators. Really, really happy and proud to be in a community of people who can make us legible to each other in Spanish, Portuguese, English, and Chinese. So grateful to every one of the translators that has been with us for these now almost 2.5 hours. Also grateful to Amilcar Guerra and the team of technologists, people who have managed to keep us on track, whether it's maintaining the Zoom room, this or that. Lots of people build a webinar like this. And of course, many of them are the team at No Cold War. We're very happy to have created the space for this conversation. We welcome and ask you to come to our website, nocoldwar.org. We have a statement there now, a few years old, but we'd like you to read the statement. But what we'd very much like you to do is to follow us on social media, promote the work that we are doing at No Cold War. Look out for this webinar when it gets uploaded at YouTube, and make sure to share as many of the links as possible. It was fitting that Jody ended our webinar talking about the necessity of the streets. The streets are necessary. They are the place where we make the powerful fear us, because we are the majority. We are the people. We are the future. They are the past, and they are the past in so many different ways. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and see you next time.
Abaixo com o capitalismo! Abaixo com o
Abaixo.
socialismo! Abaixo com o sionismo! Viva a revolução!
Viva.
Pronto para a revolução!
Viva.
Viva a
Viva.
revolução!
Long live the revolution. Long live socialism. All the way till victory. We will win.